Hello again, and thanks for spending a few minutes with me. And we know what's coming. It's this wonderful parable of the prodigal son in chapter 15 of Luke. But I want to start in a different place. As I have scanned across the way this chapter is often taken, it's taken as an isolated story without reference to the grand plan that Luke has in mind. And as I said before, what we're looking at here is how the story is told and not immediately try to determine a meaning. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. I hope as you prepare this, you're going to look at the entire chapter because it's critical to getting an insight what Luke is doing with that material. I think the absolute rock solid Jesus material most clearly is in verse 1. So please don't just consider this as a kind of a throat clearing of Luke. It says that Jesus is being criticized. The sentence structure of what the narrator tells us they're saying, which is not exactly perhaps what they said, but is rather Luke's twist on it. It reads this way: this guy, sinners, and then the word, if you want to look up the Greek, dechomai, receives. Now, that word is interesting. That's almost invites, entertains, elicits a response from, and then adds the second verb, and sits down and eats with them. That's absolutely rock solid, the way Jesus is presented throughout the synoptic gospels, at least, as one who is inviting, not just tolerating, but seeking. Now, that's important because that sets the tone for three seeking stories. It's important to pay attention to Luke's total narrative design in this plot, from the Gospels right through Acts. He does this so beautifully. It looks just absolutely pristine in terms of its narrative style. But sometimes that which looks easy is not simple. A little bit, I'd like to say, like trying to learn to be a true caster of bait, a fly fisherman. It looks easy and looks beautiful, but let me tell you, when you actually try to do it, the muscle memory issue is pretty intense. Also, with this narrative, the style that Luke has, it can lead easily to a bad take on this parable. Again, let's start with the two other lost stories. The first is well known because it's repeated in others of the Gospels, but not the second one, the lost coin. So clearly, Luke is here creating a parable, or has found another parable, and he wants to create a triad of lost and recovered objects. He does this by having theme words that keep getting repeated in fascinating ways. Lost is one of those, keeps getting repeated. The one most repeated, and this is where I think I'd like you to pay some attention in your own processing, is joy, or the verbal form, to rejoice. The same root stem, of course. That we see 5 times. This is a product of joy, this finding. And we could say successful finding of that which is lost. There's repetition also of sinners. And that's very clever because, as I told you in the first verse, we have, he invites sinners. And then, of course, later on in the parable, as it concerns the lost son, he is referred to, in fact, himself as a sinner. Not once, but twice. So we have a triad of lost and found, joyful rediscoveries. Now, to the actual parable itself. The word prodigal, of course, is a very good Old English word. We don't use it a lot. But you'll notice in some revisions in the vernacular, if there's a title to this section, it might be titled The Two Sons. Now, the real question here is this one parable with an addition, or is this a actual unified parable? The answer is it's one parable with vast reworking of the Jesus material that I'm certain is behind it in a most sophisticated way. One of the things we can do in terms of how something is written is to observe very carefully things like word count and how much of the story is actual dialogue and how much is in narrator control. This tells us a lot about where the writer wants us to focus attention rather than just impose our own agenda. The speeches of the father in this parable are in Greek almost 80 words. The actual speech of the first son, the younger son, and remember, he repeats himself, is in the neighborhood of 60 plus Greek words. The eldest son, the older son, or as in Greek, the Presbyterian son, is about 40 words. So there's a kind of a hierarchy. The focus here is, in fact, on the father and the father's role. It's often preached, of course, in quite the reverse, that it's mainly about the son. Remember that the attitude in verse 1 that's being criticized about Jesus is that he is inviting and sitting with sinners. So the idea that the parable really focuses upon the Father is absolutely consistent with the cohesiveness that Luke wants to weave into this. The parable has often been interpreted in ways of a one-to-one equivalent. That is actually maybe the worst way to interpret it. I've heard it preached that way very often. It is true that Luke in his plot is concerned, as he was in the last reading we talked about, of the unfruitful fig tree. Luke is concerned about the fact that there are going to be two audiences for the good news as it evolves in the plot, as Luke recreates the history of the church. That means that there's going to be some resentment on those who are saying, this person who is a sinner and pays no attention to Torah, these people who eat food that's unclean, you're making a big thing about their response to the good news. Well, what about us? Or as Paul has said in some places, to the Jews belong the covenants and the Torah and the elders and the patriarchs and the promises. That kind of theme that we see in Paul in Romans 9, 10, 11. That is consistent a bit with what Luke is trying to do here. However, that is not the essence of the parable. If you want to look at the Jesus intent behind these kinds of stories. And that intent is laid bare by the way Luke writes this entire chapter, from the scant backstory that gives us most of the clues, the two lost stories, and then the lost son and recovered son story. Those are consistent with regard to an overarching theme that really should not be brought down to specify groups, but rather is an indication of the openness that Jesus has revealed as totally new, coming from the divine understanding of humankind. I know you're going to do some wonderful preaching from this passage, but work through it with regard to the beauty of the narrative and allow it to perk down a bit before you decide what it really means. Well, I look forward to seeing you next time.